Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Tom Scott, recently retired as the CIO at Steel Inc. We're super excited to have Tom with us for a keynote presentation titled IT Leadership Beyond the Human Operating System. Welcome, Tom. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm happy to be with you here today. Just a little bit about myself. I, like Nick said, retired recently in January after a 43-year career in IT. And some of the places I've been a CIO for the last 30 years at I think 8 different companies from 100 million up to 20 million. Some of the more notables are VF Corporation, the big apparel manufacturing company, Dollar Tree, and most recently Steel, the outdoor power equipment company. And so I'm going to talk today about leadership in this thing, as you see in the title, Going Beyond the Human Operating System. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute. But first, here's how I even got into that and became familiar with it. Early in my career, I started my career at then Arthur Andersen Consulting, which became Andersen Consulting and is now Accenture. After that, I went with Nordstrom. And after a year or two, I was promoted to be the systems development manager. This was in the mid to late 80s. At that point, Nordstrom was about a $5 billion retailer. We were running large mainframe systems. It was almost mostly heavy custom development. I had 125 developers in my department. And we were, in terms of development technology, we were early adopters of a few things and fairly early stage on a lot. So we were doing things like code generation when it first came out of the gate. We were one of Oracle's first relational database customers. We used a full-scale methodology, a fourth, what was then kind of leading edge, a fourth generation language to do reporting. We were doing Agile before the term was popular. We used function and feature points to measure systems, measure quality, and we were even an early adopter of the software capability maturity model. But as a young manager, I was, I'd played a lot of sports and I'd been on a few teams that were really high performance teams. They just had a certain feel to them and it was energizing and you felt like, man, we are really producing. And while we were doing good work at Nordstrom, I didn't feel like we were working up to our potential. Results, I thought we could do more. There was a bit of a status quo mindset. Sometimes it was difficult to get decisions made, unproductive meetings. Have interpersonal conflicts, hard to get alignment sometimes, long wait times, whether it's getting decisions made or getting things moving. And we had some unsatisfied customers. And we rated fairly high on the software capability maturity model. When we first started, we were at a 4, and I left before they got it to a level 5. But so, and I've noticed these same things in my entire career. And so somewhere in there, I ran across a guy, his name was Dick Hab, and he and I are partners in a post-retirement business, and we're co-authoring a book on this. And he brought me something that was just really interesting. And I thought at the time, maybe this helps get to the heart of how to get better results. Maybe this is something that really gets leverage. And I've experimented with it and used it over the last 40 years, and it's done exactly that. Its basis was in some work he did at Intel. Intel at that point had put out the 286 chip and the 386 chip, but they were really concerned that Motorola was about a year ahead of them on their equivalent 486 chip, and they thought they might leapfrog them. So my friend Dick was involved in trying to cut a year out of the life cycle of the 486. And as it turned out, they did. He was just one guy, but he, wasn't all him, but he participated on the teams. And he had said while he was at Intel, he noticed not everybody, but most of the product managers were neuroscientists. They were heavily tied into with Stanford University. And they told him what they were doing is, we're trying to figure out better how the brain works so we can make faster computer chips, which they did. They learned a lot about the brain in that era out of the semiconductor industry. But there were several offshoots from their research and studies, and a lot of it had to do with human dynamics. And so my friend Dick took some of that content and actually developed a consulting practice that he's done for also 30 years on this thing that he named it originally the human operating system. And it's at the basis of what I'm going to talk about today. So some of this you may have gained on your own already. You may have discovered it and you're using things, but I'm intent today is to try and make it explicit so you can make even more use of it. So here in layman terms in a couple slides is this thing we're calling the human operating system. So the basics are we have somewhere between 86 and 200 billion brain cells. Scientists don't seem to be able to agree. 98% are for subconscious living. 70% of our brain cells are for what they termed as survival. It's the job of 70% of these cells, and it's mostly in our midbrain and hindbrain regions, to protect us physically, mentally, emotionally, and other ways. And it's all based on our history. And one thing it is to protect us from is each other. So one of the conclusions out of Intel was we're not really wired to work that well together, which explains a lot, at least in my experience, on those things we were observing at Nordstrom. Now there's another region of the brain I'm going to talk about in the frontal lobe, which is the logic, values, and intention center. This is a generative region. This is where if we're going to do something proactively, based on what we value or what we intend to do, we have to invoke that part of the brain. And otherwise, the survival part of the brain is going to run the show. We can kind of override it. Say, yeah, okay, thanks for sharing that, survival center. I'm going to do something different. And that we call generation. It's going beyond these survival-based defaults. So we have to purposefully invoke this frontal lobe, and it requires practice to mastery. It's like going to the gym. You can study about weights, but if you're not actually in the gym, you're not going to build muscle. So I've been trying to build those muscles for the last 30 years, these generative muscles in terms of human dynamics and leadership. So there's this concept that ties up here called memory frame. So this is my layman's view in pretty simplistic form of how all this survival center business works. So first off, as humans, we take in things through our senses. So we see, what we touch, what we smell, taste, and what we hear. That invokes neural cells, and most of those neural cells are put into groups already that are called neural networks. We start, the people at Intel and others, by the way, they were heavily tied in with Stanford Research Center, their neuroscience department. They say, when we're babies, we start building new neural networks. But by the time we're about 14, it shifts. We still build some neural cells throughout our life, but basically from that rough time frame, 14, 15 years old, our brain starts doing more to search and find the neural networks that we've already built. And these neural networks are put into frames that help us know what to do in certain circumstances. So, it's a reason we don't walk in front of a bus, because we have a frame that says don't walk in front of a bus. A good one is the hot stove frame. Our mothers probably told us when we were kids, don't touch the hot stove. Some of us listen, but we have a mother-based hot stove frame. Some of us touch the hot stove and we have a frame. So the next time we see a red glow, well, in the old days, red glowing stove, we know we don't touch it. And so these frames serve us really well from a survival basis. It keeps us alive. It helps us do everything we do, drive a car without having to think about it every step of the way. And so these frames are good things, but again, they're all based on our history. And with each one of these memory frames, they're associated with a particular chemical signature. And the makeup of the survival center, which isn't an actual center, it's just a name applied to the different functions in the brain that are survival based. The brain's looking to have us be comfortable, be associated with what's familiar and things that are predictable. And so that's what it's trying to do. Once it takes in sensory input, it starts doing a rapid search through all these thousands, probably millions of memory frames that we have stored, and looking for one that fits the sensory input that we've received, its chemical signature, and it's looking for one that's going to either bring us back to or keep us in a state of what's comfortable, familiar, and predictable. That's the whole essence of this survival center, is these memory frames. Again, they're good things. They're great. Most of the time, we just are good going with the defaults, but sometimes we want to go beyond them. And the assertion I'm making today is that they're great leaders know how to go beyond the survival center defaults when the situation calls for it, when leadership is needed. So that's probably the headline of the presentation today. But these frames help explain how we listen, how we speak, and how we make decisions. Here's how it manifests on a day-to-day basis whether we're talking with just another person or whether we're in a meeting. Think about meetings you're in and whether you can tell whether these are things that more often than not run the show and keep you from being really high performance. So it has us listen, speak, make decisions based on looking good and avoiding looking bad, being right and avoiding being wrong, dominating and avoiding being dominated, self-justifying and avoid being invalidated, winning and avoid losing. And two big ones, find the flaw and assign negative intent. I mean, I could think so many meetings I go into, the default is people, if a new idea comes up, people immediately go to finding the flaw, which sometimes is good. If you're in a system design review meeting, you want to find the flaw. But a lot of ideas, even system design ideas, get killed because they never get enough oxygen to even consider the value in them or the possibility, because the survival center is so heavy at find the flaw and assigning negative intent. She's trying to take over my team. Oh, she's trying to look better to the boss than me. Assign negative intent. Those two are very pervasive. So there are multiple ways, that this can manifest, like dozens, and we don't have time to go into that. But the one that we found from experience that people seems to resonate the most is a notion that we call at risk versus at stake. The survival center sort of default sort of automatically have us operate at risk. And the term comes from the gold rush days, where a miner would walk into a hardware store, and a lot of times didn't have any money, so the merchant would give him a grub stake, give him a shovel, give him a pan, etc. And it turns out that the merchant could get nothing back for the supplies. If the guy doesn't find gold, what the merchant had at risk was all those tools that he may never get paid for. What he has at stake, what he might gain, is they would do it on a basis of a share. If the miner strikes gold, then the merchant would get 5% or whatever of the gold, and he might get way more than what he had at risk. So this notion of at risk and at stake. And teams by default, because it's the brain survival path, operate at risk. They play not to lose, protect what could be lost. And teams, there's all kinds of teams, not just athletic teams, but work teams is what I'm really referring to here. But teams will naturally kind of protect what could be lost, look good and avoid looking bad, and avoid risk. There's a choice, though, that if you recognize that's what you're either doing personally or what your team is doing, then you can generate being at stake. Again, you have to generate that. It's actually invoking a different part of the brain, but it basically means, getting your teams, even yourself, to play to win, to go for what there is to gain, to do good and embrace risk. One of the companies I went into recently as a CIO, it was almost just a really extreme case of at risk. People were, they were afraid to lose their job. The prior CIO was, if you made a mistake, it was, you were taken out back. Not really, but metaphorically. There was a time, after I got there, they were telling me stories for like 4 months of how bad it was. There were times when he'd stand at the front door with a stopwatch, and if people were late, he would just, look at the watch and look at them. So, that's an extreme case. None of your places are probably like that. But still, that was my biggest intention then, was to generate an at-stake environment there, and we did. Told people, look, most of the learning you get anywhere is in the mistakes. So we may not like mistakes, but they happen in IT. We dealt with 50 tickets a day at this place, and we're going to value them for the learning. So we almost, celebrated the mistake. It's a tightrope. It's like, you don't want to encourage mistakes, but it's like, hey, if you made a mistake, all right, congratulations. Now, what do we learn from it? And instead of finding who to blame, it was, okay, let's get it fixed right away. And now what do we learn from it? That, plus painting a picture of a future of what operating at stake could look like, were the things that really made a difference. Saying, look, here's the environment we could be having, a year from now. We could be producing so much work. Our business users are telling us to slow down and stop. They can be so delighted with this. They're not questioning everything. Painting a picture of what people are committed to. And you know what? It was very successful. If you just look at on paper what got accomplished in a year, it was 5 times as much. If you want to normalize it for size, maybe it was at least 3 to 5x with only slight increase in staff. At this place, it made a huge difference in the ability to produce results. So this is what leaders do, is help transform at-risk oriented teams who are kind of being driven by their survival centers. They're acting normally. That's what the survival center does. To people at stake, people who recognize they're operating at risk, and they start going for what there is to gain, and just playing to win. Here's a couple other quick examples of this. There's a couple of studies in a book called, I forget now, Play to Win or something like that. Top Dog, Play to Win. He studied hundreds, thousands of soccer shootout matches. And in the cases where, not on the final shot, this is not on the final shot where if you make it, you win, if you miss it, you lose. But if it happened anywhere before that, if the team was to lose, if a guy missed the shot, they made it 62% of the time. If his team was going to win, if they made the shot, the make percentage was 92%. Here's another example. Study at Princeton, 124 undergraduates that they paired as evenly as they possibly could, and gave them exactly the same test. One they called intellectual ability test. The other one they called intellectual challenge. So the people who had the ability, it was like they were at risk. What if I don't do well? What if it shows I'm not very smart? And the other one was just a challenge. Oh, it's a challenge. What if I go for it there as a game? You can see the difference there. 72% score on the ability and 90% on when it's framed as a challenge. All right, so what are some things you could do with this? Again, Dick, my partner, when he'd present this, would do it in day-long seminars. Now he's retired now. I'm not pushing him or anything. Or 2-day seminars, some 6 months. So there's a lot behind this, but I wanted to give you something you could do right away. Here's something you could do. Just start noticing what kind of survival frames your brain is sending up. When you walk into a meeting and someone says something, are you going immediately to find the flaw, assigning negative 10? Just the noticing of it could make a difference. And then notice how it's shaping your listening, speaking, and decision making. Next, see if you can discover what's occurring to other people. People's actions are correlated to what occurs to them. So if you want to change behavior, shift their occurring. If other people are operating from looking good or avoiding looking bad or dominating, if you notice it, you might be able to say something in a meeting that shifts it. And then start experimenting with this generative listening, speaking, to decision making. I'm going to give you a quick fire hose of both of those and then go on to some questions. So what is generative listening? Well, instead of find the flaw and negative intent, listen for value, what works about something. Listen for clarity. I ask probably half the questions I ask in meetings are for clarity. And most of the time it's not because I'm not clear. It's because I think someone else is clear. So get clear on things. Is it generative listening? It doesn't happen automatically. What's possibly missing? If that thing were put in place, it would move this meeting forward. Think for possibilities instead of flaws at times. Opportunity, what could you actually take into action? Trying to understand what other people's perspective is. Listen for what their commitment is. Behind every complaint and concern, there's a commitment. And knowing what someone's committed to could help you, forward what they're doing or shift how they might be looking at something. And then finally, occurring. What's occurring to the other person? If we want to change behavior, shifting the occurring is the thing that has the most leverage. And then finally, what are generative conversations, generative speaking? My friend Dick created this conversation wheel. If there's something missing in your meeting and you want to make a difference and put it in place, or just talking with the person, it's likely one of these 6 conversations. There's either relationship missing, so you have a conversation for relationship. Possibility, people are finding the flaw. Well, okay, let's think of what this could possibly do for us if we took this action. Opportunity, what are the things we can actually take to action? Action, this is the one missing more often than not that I see in meetings, besides clarity, is not specifying what you're actually going to do, who's going to do it, by when. And so things go on and on without anything happening, and completion. Clarity all the time. One quick story on this, a colleague from Austria about a year ago, I had a phone call with him and he got us, oh, Tom, I just have to express. I just walked out of the same meeting I've had 8 times in a row. He said, I'm not kidding. It's literally almost the same meeting, everybody in the same thing over and over again, no decisions being made, and we're not getting into action. And I don't know what to do about it. So that might be an extreme case, but I see it all the time, that kind of thing that happens in meetings. All right, now with 1 minute left before questions, I'm going to give you one other kind of sideline thing: meeting design and facilitation. Traditional, survival-based. You say, have an agenda, list things to talk about. In a generative meeting, you have a purpose, which paints a picture of why you're even having the meeting. The big thing is the intended results. Generate a clear statement of the tangible things that will be produced by the end of the meeting. This will make such a big difference in terms of action. Like, we're going to walk out of the meeting with a list of this, with a decision on that, etc. Get tangible with what you want to do. And an agenda is simply a best ordering of conversations that will allow you to achieve those intended results. All right, that was a bit of a fire hose. I know I wanted to give you as much as I could in a short period of time. Nick, I think we may have some questions. You want to?
Yes, we do, Tom. Thanks so much. Here's one from the audience. What are some common obstacles or resistant points that leaders face when trying to move their organization past business as usual into an innovation mindset? And how can we overcome them?
I love that question. By the way, innovation comes from the frontal lobe. It doesn't come from the survival center. One of the biggest obstacles I've seen is if you want to move, say, your own IT organization into kind of the, what we've been talking about here, the rest of the company may be wired against it. You may be and in fact, unless you have some really enlightened leaders, you are probably working in the bigger company in a survival-based framework. And so that's one of the biggest obstacles is if you're, and here's how it could manifest. You walk into a design meeting, you have your people that are kind of tuned into this and they're avoiding find the flaw, but your user group is going right to find the flaw and right to assign negative intent. So you have to find ways you can have introduce the kind of conversations into meetings with other people who may not be grounded in this and shift they're occurring. For example, if you see someone's doing find the flaw, you could say, you know what, I think it's important that we find the flaw on this. And I think you probably see things I don't. But I'd wonder if we could just take a minute and first just talk about what works with this before we do find the flaw. And then we'll do what works and then we'll go to find the flaw. Would that be okay with everyone if we did this? And there's a number of different things you can say like that, but it's really, most of it comes down to managing conversations, especially in meetings.
Okay, great. Here's another one. How do you suggest identifying and challenging the default settings of our human operating systems to become better leaders?
Yeah, the identifying is really, you just start noticing to what you're saying to yourself. We actually call listening sometimes what we are saying to ourselves. Our brain serves up these survival frames and it's almost like a conversation in our head. So you start with catching yourself, and meetings are a good laboratory for it, because when you're talking one-on-one with someone, you probably need to respond after they stop speaking. But in a meeting, you have the luxury of listening. You may not have to respond right away, and you could just start paying more attention to your own listening and even your own speaking. I catch myself all the time, and it's not like you get rid of these survival defaults. You basically notice them and then you generate beyond them. So I catch myself all the time doing find the flaw, and sometimes I'll even speak it. And I say, you know what? I know I just showed what might not work with this. Johnny, you're presenting this. Tell me why you think this is such a good idea. So first off, it's noticing, catching yourself, and then generating something different. And then again, when you go beyond that, then you work to influence other people so they can maybe do the same thing, or at least you can at least get it somewhat out of a survival-based conversation.
Great. And I think we have time for one more. Could you provide examples of specific leadership principles that have led to high-performance IT results?
Yeah, one of the biggest principles, the biggest principle is just this, for me, in my experience, has been having this notion of the human operating system and the survival center and how it will run the show and what these defaults are. And so if you can notice those, then what you can do beyond it from a principle basis is, okay, generate the kind of conversations we've been talking about, and look at moving teams from at risk to at stake. Look at how you can use more influence as opposed to authority power. As managers, we use a lot of authority power, sometimes influence, but leaders, we've noticed, use much more influence than authority power. So think about that. Think of how you can not rely on authority power and do as much as you can to influence. And that one thing I talked about another principle is people's actions are correlated to what occurs to them. So if you want to shift behavior or what people are doing, see if you can shift their occurring. That's another thing. See if you can start listening to what's occurring to people, and then you have new possibilities for how you can shape, by shifting their occurring, how they're acting. For example, like, oh, you think that she's doing this because she's taking the team. Well, turns out she said to me she does not want that team. That could shift someone's occurring after going to, what happened and why they have the occurring that they do. So there's 2 or 3, but in this whole body of work, there's like dozens of these things from a principle standpoint that are useful.
Great. Well, thank you again, Tom, for such an incredible keynote. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. For those of you who earned points throughout today's event, an Argyle team member will be following up with the winners in the next couple of weeks. This officially concludes the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. Thank you again for joining us today and engaging in our content. We look forward to seeing you at our next Argyle Digital CIO event soon, which will be our CIO Leadership Forum, Leading Digital Business Acceleration, on April 11th, 2024. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for listening.